They've been pillars of the China watching community for years in DC. As a CIA guy, I was always more of an outlier, but they always welcomed my participation. I suppose you could say that between the three of us, we have about 150 years of experience. But you know, as the updated slogan goes, that and $5 will get you a cup of coffee. But I actually knew Gaston Sigur when he was Assistant Secretary of State for Asia, and I held him in very high regard. And I also taught part-time courses here in this building at the invitation of Harry Harding about 20 years ago. So this is a bit of a homecoming for me. The Conscience of the Party is a prequel to this book, which I wrote at Brookings Institution about 20 years ago. It's called Beyond Tiananmen: The Politics of U.S.-China Relations, 1989 to 2000. Both books were supported by the Smith-Richardson Foundation. Both books are historical in intent, chronological in format. Both have political theoretical implications and observations, but neither would probably pass muster in a modern poli-sci course. Both are research heavy and both were overly long first drafts. It seems my CIA training of writing brief, concise papers for busy policymakers was discarded almost immediately after I left. I had been chief of the domestic policy branch of the China division of the Director of Intelligence during most of Hu Yaobang's tenure as CCP chairman and general secretary. And we paid a lot of attention to his rise and fall. But I did not use those papers, although most of them are available on the FOIA site. I did not use those papers, which were mostly written by others anyway, as source material. I covered Hu Yaobang's final few months as general secretary and beyond Tiananmen, but I didn't pay much attention to his personality, policies, attitudes, associates, enemies, successes, and failures. I tried to make up for that in this more recent book by using almost entirely open source material available in the Chinese language, published in the PRC and particularly in Hong Kong. One of my great laments about the loss of Hong Kong was the loss of that place as a publishing base that was unobstructed. It's now gone. For 16 years after his death in April 1989 until his 90th birthday in 2005, the name of Hu Yaobang was basically taboo in the PRC media. No commemorations, no photos, no historical anecdotes, no family remembrances, nothing. It was only after the old cadre who brought him down in 1987 had themselves gone on to see Marx, and after Jiang Zemin had reluctantly let go of his power, did Hu's story begin to reemerge in 2005. Hu Jintao, who is no relation but a subordinate from their days in the Communist Youth League, acquiesced in this slow motion rehabilitation. But all the heavy lifting was done by Hu Yaobang's loyal staff, subordinates, and family members, who wrote books, articles, and especially after 2006, contributed to online networks devoted to contemporary history, including CCP history. Yanhuang Chunqiu was the banner publication for this movement. And it was in reading those articles that I felt like I was standing on the shoulders of giants. Men like Li Rui, Shen Zhihua, who's speaking today at the Wilson Center, Han Gang, Wang Haiguang, Xu Jinquan, Shen Baoxiang, and Zhang Liqun, three of whose children, and many who only shared one anecdote or so to contribute to the rebuilding of his legacy. And that, my friends, is why it took me 10 years to complete this biography. Not only is there an ocean of material out there about Hu Yaobang, but it's all in Chinese. And this foreign devil didn't even start learning Chinese until he was 21. So this is my version of the Hu Yaobang's life. Born and raised a Hakka peasant in eastern Hunan, one of 4 children out of 12 who survived to adulthood, just under 5 feet tall, just over 100 pounds. Very heavy Hunan accent, high voice, walked 12 miles to and from elementary school every day. Brilliant scholarly career in a Western-oriented middle school was cut short by ravaging warlord forays through Hunan province. And he went up to Jinggangshan at the age of 14 to become a revolutionary. Too small to be a soldier, he was an agitprop specialist who gravitated toward the Youth League. He survived the long march, barely, and helped Mao hone the broken and dispirited CCP and into a capable army by writing articles, weeding out suspected spies of the Kuomintang, and learning Mao Zedong's ideology and earning his trust. After the Japanese surrender, Hu Yaobang volunteered to join the North China Field Army and was a senior political commissar under Xu Xiangqian, Nie Rongzhen, and Peng Dehuai, participating in several high casualty battles, including the bloodbath at Taiyuan, where 43,000 PLAs lost their lives. Eventually, he ended up in Sichuan as a sub-provincial administrator under Deng Xiaoping. He was not a protege of Deng's and always said so. And although they regularly played contract bridge together, they were not friends. In 1952, both were transferred to Beijing to join the new government. Hu was not happy to be assigned to head the Communist Youth League, but Mao was the one that made the decisions, and he was not in a position to question it. And he also did the job successfully for the next decade. While watching the personnel and policy disputes among the senior leaders, degrade both the CCP and the PRC government. The Great Leap Forward, over 30 million dead, perhaps twice that number, according to some estimates. Personnel politics became highly personal, toxic, and damaging. Hu sought a provincial assignment to Hunan in 1962, where he worked with Huaguofeng. But Mao was already radicalizing that province, and Hu's preference for improving agricultural production put him out of sync with the other provincial leaders who were stoking ideological fervor. He returned to Beijing. In 1964, he was assigned to Shanxi, which was deteriorating into violence and factional infighting. Hu still was pro-Mao, but the Northwest Bureau was aligned with Liu Shaoqi and began attacking Hu within a month of his arrival. He spent more than half of his sojourn there under constant political and ideological attack, which ruined his health. In June of 1965, Ye Jianying flew in on a military plane and took him back to Beijing and out of the line of fire. But in Beijing, the Cultural Revolution was brewing. Hu was recuperating from Shanxi, but stood in his CYL colleagues with them and paid a heavy price. Mao criticized him at an August CCP plenum, and the Red Guards came for him shortly after that. From that point forward, he was subject to daily criticism, denunciation, beatings began in autumn, often drawing blood, causing him to lose consciousness, serious bruising, unable to stand. In my book, I look on the Cultural Revolution not as an organized movement, not as an ideological trend, but as a series of struggles around a failing Mao, disorganized and inchoate. Hu was brought back from the CYL cowshed to attend a party plenum in 1968. They needed to denounce Liu Shaoqi, and he knew that's why he was going. But at least it got a bit out of incarceration. But he refused to knuckle under to Jiangxin and Kangsheng and was excluded from the 9th Congress and sent to labor reform in Hunan province until after Lin Biao was purged in 1971. The Cultural Revolution turned Hu against Mao and his practices, and to a certain degree his ideology. Hu helped Deng try to restore some semblance of order in 1975. Deng did not request him, but Ye Jianying did suggest that he join that team, and Deng went along. But he fell again when a senile Mao purged Deng yet again. After Mao's death, the purge of the Gang of Four brought Huaguofeng and Ye Jianying to the fore, both of them favorably disposed toward Hu Yaobang. He served at the party school, in the organization department, the propaganda department, and helped Deng take control at the 3rd plenum in November 1978. He became general secretary in 1981, but had no power because of the power structure of the old men were in charge, Deng and Shen Yun. Hu Yaobang defined comprehensive reform in a speech in 1983. Reform, he said, must be part of every policy, every department. It's not a set of specific policies, but it's an attitude toward change. If you make a mistake and you're bound to acknowledge it, correct it, improve the problem, don't hold grudges, and don't try to hold onto wrong policies. Chen Yun and Hu Qianmu shortly after that speech tried to purge it, but Deng Xiaoping and Ye Jianying refused to go along. Hu Yaobang also advocated changing the CCP's habitual method of discussion and struggle. And he was quite well known for having a 4 no's. No pulling pigtails, no beating with sticks, no putting on hats, labeling, and no bringing secret document bags. And that was something that was part of the problem all throughout the Cultural Revolution, just having people interrogated and bringing that evidence straight into interrogating the next person. Hu had dropped out of middle school at the age of 14 to join the revolution. Went on the Long March, barely survived it, prospered under province mate Mao Zedong at Yan'an, was a political commissar in the Civil War, participated in several costly battles. As General Secretary after 1980, he was an excellent organizer, writer, and speaker, despite his heavy accent. As General Secretary after 1982, Hu excelled at organizing CCP congresses and plenums, using writing groups, and he brought major changes in personnel politics in 1985. For that reason, the old guys were afraid of him. And they decided that they had to do something about him. After Ye Jianying died in October 1986, Hu's pressure on Deng and Chen to resign lost a key backer. And within a matter of weeks, student demonstrations were an excuse to purge Hu Yaobang in the same way that they had done with Guo. Demonstrations were not the issue. But Hu Yaobang was nonetheless broken for being responsible for those demonstrations. At a party life meeting, merciless criticism for 6 days. In mid-January 1987, the party officially removed him as general secretary, replaced him with Zhao Ziyang. But the Chen-Deng battle for subordinates led to poor leadership decisions and public disaffection with failing reform. Hu was still allowed to stay on the Politburo Standing Committee, but he was given no power or responsibility, and his health continued to deteriorate. He died at a Politburo meeting in April 1987. So why is Hu admired? He didn't have a lot of presence, shall we say. I mean, a guy 5 feet tall, even in a Chinese audience, is not going to stand out. But he did have a lot of things that caused people in China to admire him. One, he spoke his mind. He didn't matter who he was talking to. 2, he wanted you to speak your mind. 3, he was a man of extraordinary character. He was not crooked. He did not try to bend the rules. He did not try to make his children rich. He was an honest, straightforward person who spoke the truth to power, even when it cost him. He was calm. He was a peasant's peasant. Didn't change his name when he was young. He traveled to of all of the Chinese Xian, and I think there were 2,300 of them, something like that. He visited almost 2/3 of them. And of all the ones that were designated as poor, he got to almost all of them. He would rather go out and make a speech to a bunch of peasants than sit in Zhongnan High and listen to speeches made to him. And people knew that. They respected him. They loved him even after he was purged, and he would go to someplace, for instance, Zhangjiakou in Hunan. He was continually surrounded by people who were also visiting that site, and they wanted their pictures taken with him. And he was astonished by that. He was basically saying, "I've been purged. Why do you want to see me?" And they didn't come to ask him for favors. They just wanted to be seen with him, have their photos taken. And I think if you look at the situation in the PRC today, a lot of the former leaders have not fared too well under historical examination. Mao Zedong, the less said, the better. Zhou Enlai has been rehabilitated by Chen Jian in a book just recently published by Harvard University Press, but I'm not sure it's going to take. There's lots of bad information about Zhou Enlai. And he did a bunch of lamentable things that even his most ardent admirers will admit. Deng Xiaoping, that's still being considered. Zhao Ziyang, the jury is not out, but it's close. A lot of the things that Zhao did, including denouncing Hu Yaobang at the party life meeting, are not going to be forgotten. And some of the things that he did when he was general secretary are also not looked upon favorably. Hu Jintao, Jiang Zemin, the less said the better. Neither of them came out of those jobs with a particularly glowing reputation, but Hu Yaobang still elicits admiration for these sort of uncertain, kind of subjective reasons that I outlined before. So in some ways, writing this book was easy. And I found myself often trying to not overdo it. I mean, most biographies in Chinese are hagiographies. They either are way over the top, or they're way under the bottom. You know, any biography of Deng Xiaoping is not going to get you much admiration. But Hu Yaobang is still admired. But here's the rub, and this is a rub that has affected me directly. Xi Jinping does not want the Chinese people to read this book or any other book about Hu Yaobang. The Hu Yaobang Historical Materials Information Web was closed down in September of 2023, just as I was getting to my final phase of the draft of this book. And it went silent. And I thought, well, I've still got all the citations, just nobody else is going to be able to get them. But then in November, they opened the site up again. And almost all the articles, some of them were taken out, but most of the articles were there, but every one of them had a different URL. So which rendered the footnotes equally useless. But I was somewhat intrepid at that time. And I scraped through the Hu Yaobang website, got all the new URLs and put them in the final draft, which went to the proof, galley proofs in April of this year. In April of 2024, the Hu Yaobang website was closed down again, and it has not reopened. But I have an antidote. The antidote is, and I feel like a politician, sort of, here's my website. But I now have a website at https://www.robertsuettiner.com, and there's a section in there called the missing footnotes. And what I did was I had made copies when I was reading the original documents of all of the material that I used from any source. But I took all the ones from the Hu Yaobang website, and I made them into PDFs, put them there, and I used a DeepL translation. DeepL is pretty good, but it's not perfect. But anyway, there's more than 400 of them that they took off that website, which is still down in China. I check it almost every day to find out whether or not they've decided that the benefits of learning about Hu Yaobang with the problems. Well, they don't. But it's my debt to historians who still want to seek truth from facts. They can find articles by Li Rui, by Gao Hua, and by any number of other what I consider to be courageous historians in the PRC, if they want to take the time to do it. So that's basically my spiel. And I will leave it to David to eviscerate me and a lot on it.
Bob, I can promise you, I'm not going to eviscerate you. I'm going to be a hagiographic discussant. Now, in all sincerity, this is a genuine honor to serve as a discussant for my longtime friend and colleague, Bob Suettinger's really magisterial study. I'm going to try and be brief in this role because Bob's book is the purpose of today's event, and because we want to get to a question and answer period, both here in person and online, which my colleague Bob Sutter is going to moderate. So if you're online, by the way, please do start sending in questions and we'll field them. So let me begin, though, with a rather tantalizing counterfactual hypothetical. What if Hu Yaobang had not died when he did on April 15th, 1989? And what if there had not been, I should say, a spontaneous outpouring of grief by students and other citizens in Beijing during the subsequent days in Tiananmen Square? Well, there would have been no trigger, so to speak, for the subsequent 6 weeks of massive pro-democracy demonstrations that brought millions of people into the square and the streets of Beijing. No demonstrations, no June 4th massacre. So, what if he had not died then? Well, one can only speculate, of course. But under then General Secretary Zhao Ziyang, about whom I actually written a biography many decades ago, my first book. Well, Zhao Ziyang replaced him, as Bob just said, in 1987 as General Secretary, having moved over from the premiership. But under Zhao, and indeed when Zhao and Hu were working together, China would quite likely have developed into a much more liberal, open, conciliatory country and regime. Zhao very likely would have continued his political and other reforms, even though he was coming under rather intense pressure at the time for economic overheating. He had already, Zhao now, had set up a political structural reform research group under the general office of the Central Committee, and this group were considering a number of potential reforms, including direct elections up to the provincial level and eventually at the national level, a genuinely elected and empowered national legislature, a more independent judiciary, a Hong Kong and or Singapore style civil service, the separation of party and government, Dang Zheng Feng Kai, the separation of party and military, Dang Jun Feng Kai, greater intra-party democracy, Dang Ne Minzhu, and decentralizing power from Beijing to the provinces and creating a federal-style national economic and legal system. These were all actively underway, and at least at the research phase, papers have been written, proposals made, and then Hu Yaobang died, and Zhao, as we know, was purged. So, had these reforms proceeded, China would have been a very different country then and now. Yet, history happens. He died when he did, and the impact of his death was huge. But as Bob Suettiner's monumental study shows, his impact during life was also huge in different ways. Let me dig into that a little bit. So this is really the definitive study on not just Hu Yaobang, but one of the most definitive studies on the PRC up to through that period. He draws on a very impressive range of Chinese language primary sources, most never previously examined in this almost 500-page magnum opus, which is the result of, as I think Bob Sutter said, a decade's worth of research and writing. Those of you out there who think books are easy to write. So this study is in the tradition of granular CCP histories by others such as Roderick McFarquhar, Ezra Vogel, Michael Schoenhaus, Tony Sage, Chen Jian, and other scholars who operate like stealthy detectives, mining and weaving together disparate Chinese sources into highly detailed and original empirical histories. Now, in Comrade Suettiner's case, there are 78 pages of footnotes, which are testimony to his use of many rare books, previously untapped periodicals, and an extensive range of materials available on the internet. I'd like to point this out. His extensive trawling on the Chinese internet reveals just how much can now be actually accessed outside of China. Researching China today does not necessarily entail physically having to go to China to undertake the research. And this may be some solace, perhaps, for foreign scholars who have been cut off from research in situ during the Xi Jinping era. So Suettiner brings to his study decades of knowledge of the history and the inner workings of the Chinese Communist Party and its political elite, honed, as you've heard, from his dual background as both an intelligence analyst and a sinological scholar. Now let's turn to Hu Yaobang a little more. He was undoubtedly a major important figure in Chinese communist history. During his career, if I'm not mistaken, he held more formal positions than any other Chinese leader. He worked in all of the main organs of the Communist Party. I'm not going to detail them for the sake of time. They're in the book. Like so many other cadres, Hu suffered greatly during the Cultural Revolution, as Bob has just suggested. And he takes the reader through the horrors inflicted upon Hu during the Cultural Revolution in excruciating detail. Indeed, I'm sure the real pain that Hu Yaobang endured was excruciating. I'll just quote from one place, page 177. August 1966, Hu was, quote, attacked by a 17-year-old girl who slashed at his head and face with a leather belt, drawing blood. On another occasion during that period, Hu was beaten with wooden poles, and for several days, he could not stand straight or walk without crutches. In December 1966, Hu was, quote, thrown to the floor and thrashed with belts by several Red Guards, rolling around screaming in pain, according to Hu Yaobang's youth league colleague, Hu Keshir, who was punished together with him. So that's an eyewitness account that Bob Suettiner has uncovered. Hu was beaten 10 to 20 times during this period alone, between July and December 66. Okay, Suettiner then concludes that Hu survived the torment and torture because he was, quote, mentally tough, strong-willed, and stubborn, unquote, page 180. That's an understatement. Having survived 6 years of physical and mental persecution and torture, finally in October 1972, at the intervention of Zhou Enlai, Hu was finally released and allowed to return to his home in Beijing. Perhaps Hu Yaobang's greatest career contribution was in redressing the excesses of the Cultural Revolution during the periods 1975 to 78 and 82 to 86. During these periods, Hu was the, you might call him the house cleaner, who did much to correct and clean up the personnel travesties of the Mao era. As head of the organization department during 77 and 78, Hu personally oversaw and accelerated the rehabilitation of, quote, more than 500,000 wrongful party judgments affecting more than 4 million cadres and their families. He also played an instrumental role in uncapping is a term Chinese use for Mao Zedong, for hats that are put on somebody who's stigmatized and persecuted, which was done in 1957 during the anti-rightist campaign. Hu Yaobang is responsible for uncapping 547,000, at least, people labeled as rightists back in 1957. And then when the Central Discipline Inspection Commission was established in December 78, it was a new body at that point, tended to kind of clean up and police the party ranks. Hu Yaobang was appointed its first secretary. So he made major contributions in the party personnel sphere during the post-Mao transitional period. He also made very important theoretical and ideological contributions during this time as head of the Central Party School during 1977 and the Central Propaganda Department 78 to 80. This is one of the many novel things that at least I learned, and I think others will from this book that we weren't aware of before, the issues surrounding the practice of sole criterion of truth campaign. Suettiner's original research reveals that Deng Xiaoping sometimes disagreed with Hu and sometimes provided him only, quote, lukewarm support, unquote, page 240, thus offering a revisionist interpretation of conventional wisdom of Deng, just one of several places in the book where this is certainly a book about Hu Yaobang, but it's also a book in some ways about Deng Xiaoping. And it does force all of us, I think, to rethink the conventional wisdom, as it were, about Deng. Bob also revealed Hu Yaobang's ideological struggles with arch-conservative ideologues Hu Chaomu and Deng Lichun, and Deng Xiaoping himself. So during the period 77 to 79 in particular, this is when we really see, and the book brings to life, Hu Yaobang as the progressive reformer or the conscience that he really was. So in sum, and let me stop here, and so we can turn to to questions. In terms of providing an exhaustively detailed historical record of Hu's career, Bob Suettiner has contributed a real service to the China field, academic field, but more broadly, and the empirical historical record. He's assembled and scrutinized arcane information that no historian in China could dream of. And the book is a historical, contribution to the historical record that Xi Jinping is attempting to whitewash and erase with his own historical nihilism, right? This is a book that Xi Jinping would not be happy with. So I agree, Bob. It's probably not going to get translated in the mainland, but it should be. So in short, Bob Suettiner has written the definitive study of Hu Yaobang's life and times, and it's a major contribution to our understanding of Chinese communism. I congratulate you on it, recommend you all buy it. Christmas is coming, it makes a great gift for your loved ones.
Okay. Flyers for 20% off. Yeah.
Oh, we have flyers here, we get a 20% discount. Yep, okay.
Thank you.
Well, isn't that wonderful? We've just had two wonderful recountings here, and so now it's time for questions. And so people here, if you would raise your hand, and I'll call on you. And online people, if you would make your questions known, we'll be able to process them. So let's start right here.
So the first question is, while both Hu Yaobang and Zhao Ziyang are both considered reformers, but in Zhao's memoir, he did mention they had disagreement, especially later on to the 1980s. So my question is, in your book, did you explore this part, and how Hu's attitude towards their disagreement? Second question is, you mentioned that she doesn't want people to know, Chinese people to know about Hu Yaobang. Actually, I found some books about Hu Yaobang in China, like able to get some books in China, like selective work of Hu Yaobang. So how did you interpret, or you think she just think Hu Yaobang is not important enough at this point to completely ban his book? Thank you.
Okay, we take another question, please. Right, the lady here in the middle, and then we'll get people in the back.
My name is Rachel. I'm a master's student in the history department. And
Thank you.
my question is, why do you think that Hu Yaobang was so, I guess, not just incessant that there be reform, but also I guess maybe not afraid to show others that there should be reform.
Good, but I think we should stop there. At least the first one was a big set of questions. Bob, one of those.
Okay, thank you for those questions. The term reform in China has sort of taken on the same kind of multi-layers of meaning as the term strategy does in the United States. It has a tendency to drift off into whatever the speaker wants you to think it is. So to call Hu and Zhao reformers is quite fine, but it doesn't stand careful scrutiny. Hu Yaobang only began to, Deng Xiaoping began to call himself a reformer in November of 1978. I don't think Deng Xiaoping really had any idea what a reformer was. He just wanted to kickstart the economy. That was his main goal, get the four modernizations going. Hu Yaobang knew, because of his experience, that wasn't easy to do unless you had full cooperation at every sector and every part of society. Deng and Zhao, had specific policies that they said this is what reform is: separating the party and the government, currency reform, all those kinds of things. So they wanted to make it as specific as they could, so they could control it. Hu Yaobang basically blew that all open and said, let's do everything. We need to. If you're going to be a reformer, Gaiga, means that you got to change. What have you got to change? You've got to change the mistake that you made. And you've got to do that seriously, all the way down to the bottom, and don't try to hold it and divide it up into pieces. Zhao Ziyang, I think, had a different perspective on reform. I think he was much more attuned to the economic system, was much more interested in economic reforms. He brought in all kinds of academics to help him think about what kinds of reforms were needed. And ironically, once Zhao Ziyang became general secretary and they did the Dangzheng Fengkai, he basically lost his authority in the economic realm. And it went to who? Pang. And we all know how that went. And in fact, the fact that Zhao Ziyang was not able to do the kinds of things he wanted to do with the economy was part of the reason why the demonstrations became so violent. People in China had heard the terms reform, they didn't see them. And there was no difference, and there was still corruption and lots of problems. You state quite accurately that there are still books available on Hu Yaobang in China, and that's exactly right. The rehabilitation of Hu Yaobang was very carefully done by the CCP Central Committee. They had a ceremony in 2015. They brought out the second of 3 volumes of his biography, which were carefully curated, and all the stuff that might make anybody look bad were removed. So reading volumes 2 and 3 of the Hu Yaobang biography is a study in frustration because big chunks of the story are missing. The Hu Yaobang selected works are exactly that. They're selected. There's still a bit of the color of Hu Yaobang's own prose in that book, but it's been neutered to a large degree. It has been carefully selected so that Hu Yaobang seldom wrote his own. Seldom wrote the kinds of stock speeches that the Communist Party loves to give. He liked speaking on his own. He liked speaking in person to people and answering questions and so forth. So he didn't always stick to the script. But afterwards, like every other party leader, his speeches were zhengli, were carefully combed through to make them politically correct. So all of the stuff that you get in the party literature has basically been gone over by the propaganda department to make sure it's right. So yes, Hu Yaobang's still available, but all the articles or most of the articles that I cited were third-person accounts of what he did, what he said, and provided a little bit more of an in-person perspective on Hu Yaobang than are necessarily available in the books that are put out by the Central Propaganda and Publications Department. So yes, he's still available. He's not been purged, but if you want to go to his website and look at photographs or look where he lived in Hunan province, can't do it. They've just sort of said, all right, enough of Hu Yaobang admiration. Now let's get back to Xi Jinping admiration. Why was Hu Yaobang not afraid of reform? I think that the Cultural Revolution was a watershed for him. I mean, he had lived through the Great Leap Forward, and he backed away from criticizing. He went out on a inspection tour, and I believe it was 1962, and he went to Anhui Province, which was one of the worst hit by the famine, and he talked to youth league secretaries in places that had lost 40% of their county population, 40%. And he went to several of these, and he wrote it all up. And he on his way back to Beijing to give his report to Chairman Mao, he was still sort of in semi-disgrace after he didn't show enough enthusiasm for the purge of Peng Dehuai, so he was sort of sidelined. So he was trying to get himself back in Mao's good graces. So he got back, headed back to Beijing. They stopped off in Handan, and they basically rewrote his report. And all of the stuff that could be construed as critical of the Great Leap Forward was taken out. And they said, the Great Leap Forward things are getting better, thanks to Chairman Mao. And he actually, after it was all over, after after Mao was gone, he went back to Anhui and apologized to people there. He said, "I'm sorry. You had it right. I was wrong." Not many Chinese leaders do that. Let me just comment on one thing that David said about Hu Yaobang's early death. He was a guy that smoked 4 to 5 packs of cigarettes a day. He had every disease that are known to man and a few that I had to look up in the dictionary. I mean, he was 100 pounds, skinny as a rail, never ate enough food, was like a vibrating tuning fork. I mean, he was just constantly in action, so he was wearing himself out, and poisoning his body on a regular basis. So if he had lived, would things have been better? I'd like to think so, but we can't go back to that era. He died and in part, some people will say, a lot of his supporters will say he died of a broken heart. Well, he died of lung cancer, and heart disease. And it was his fate, and he brought it on himself. So, next question.
Great. More question? Yes, please, right here, and then in the back.
The gentleman right here.
You done by yourself.
I'm a student at school, and I come from China. My question is, under the current condition and so of CCP, do you think CCP can produce an image a new Hu Yaobang, next Hu Yaobang, focus on political reform?
That's a good question. My easy answer is no.
Yes.
And you know, I mean, who's failure? And I, right from the beginning of this book, I call him a failure as a reformer. And the reason was that he never, and neither did Zhao, have the kind of decision-making authority that was needed to break through the log jams and get through to the lower levels. He was just constantly at the whim of the elders, and particularly Deng Xiaoping and Shen Yun. Now, those two guys didn't much like each other, and they didn't have too many ideas in common. But when they got to focus on what they considered to be a threat to them and to their elderly colleagues, they were able to unite in support of getting rid of Hu Yaobang. I think that the kinds of culture that is prevalent within the party, he's the wall, you know, the paternalistic kind of rule that the CCP encourages, you know, 我说了算, is all ingrained there, and Xi Jinping not only hasn't improved, but he's probably made it worse. So my sense is that even if Xi Jinping were suddenly to turn around and say, I want to support all of Hu Yaobang's policies, I don't think he'd get away with it. I think that party is too ingrained in its culture. It's also too corrupt. And so, you know, I'm not saying that we need a revolution. I don't know what we need, but I don't think that the next person that comes up to the position of general secretary, if he's still a member of that party and in good standing with the rest of the party, I don't think he's going to be a reformer.
We have a question in the back. Gentlemen? Yes, please.
I'm Shibang, a PhD student in history department. I have two questions. The first is, how did Hu Yaobang approach the ethnic policy or Minzu policy when he was the Secretary General of China? Is there any difference between his policy and Deng Xiaoping or other party leaders? And the second question is, you just mentioned that Xi Jinping, he doesn't want like Chinese people read too much about Hu Yaobang. I don't disagree with you. I think you're probably right. But we also know that Hu Yaobang is very close to Xi Jinping, President Xi's father. So my question is, how do you understanding this relationship? Because we know Xi Jinping is a very important person, and they're very close. Their family are very close. Their children are very close to each other. So is it important for us to understanding anything happening in today's China? Thank you.
Thanks for those questions. When Hu Yaobang became Secretary General and then later and head of the Secretariat in 1980, one of the first things that he did, he and Wan Li, went to Tibet. They went out there on a fact-finding tour, but they also wanted to go out and encourage changes in a number of longstanding Maoist policies towards Xizang. One of them was there aren't enough Tibetan cadre, and two, the agricultural restrictions on Tibetan farmers were in many cases worse than they were on Han people in the main part of China. They went out there and had a several days tour. The Tibetans that they met with were very enthusiastic. They were happy to see him. They greeted him with warmth. He danced with some of the Tibetan women and made a very fine impression on them. The Han cadre out there treated him like an ice block. And when he went back to Beijing, basically the Central Committee decided we're not going there. We're not going to do that because at that point, 1980, Chairman Mao was still the guy that developed those policies. And therefore, we're not going to change them because they're his policies. So that Hu Yaobang, and they admitted in an article in a finding in 1984 that they had made very little progress on improving the lot of the people of Tibet, and they still had a lot that they needed to do. The closest of Hu Yaobang and Xi Jinping can be misunderstood. Xi Jinping went down to Beijing, and I can't remember what year it was, but it was in the early 1980s, perhaps even late 1970s. I'm not sure. Anybody that went down to Guangzhou was going to be in the pockets of Ye Jianying, because Ye Jianying was the landlord for that particular province, and his family made a lot of money, and he decided a lot of issues. Hu Yaobang and Ye Jianying were very close. Ye Jianying saved his life, I think, at least 3 times in 3 different circumstances. So Xi Jinping was the only person at the party life meeting in January of 1987, was the only person that stood up in defense of Hu Yaobang. And he basically told the party, the people that were there, and it was all the Politburo members, all the Secretariat members, and he said, you can't do this. This is not some Peking opera where we're throwing out the emperor. This is the Communist Party of China. We have a constitution. We have a danzhang. And this kind of a party group needs to be led by the general secretary. You can't put the general secretary on trial without having the Central Committee involved. And he began to sort of pound on the table. And Hu Yaobang, sort of put up his hand and said, Zhongxin, comrade, you can't do this. This is done, and I accept it. So he was then trundled off to Guangzhou again, and he did very well there, and I think was fairly heavily involved in Guangzhou's and Shenzhen's reform efforts. So he was a believer in loosening those strictures, and Hu Yaobang was a believer in loosening them, but they did not really work together. Hu Yaobang went to Shenzhen, I believe, in 1980 or 82. And got in some trouble for it because he was quite enthusiastic about it. Deng Xiaoping only went the year after that and didn't really start practicing the policies that Hu Yaobang recommended until the time when he went down there in the 1990s. Chen Yun never went, and Li Xianyan never went. And I don't believe Hao Guofeng ever went while he was still Secretary General. So, I mean, it wasn't that Hu Yaobang was on his own. There was a lot of bottom-up enthusiasm for the SEZs, but it was a tough slog, and Hu Yaobang didn't get much support from Deng.
Great. More questions here? Yes, the gentleman over here.
My name is Teng Biao from City Relative, New York. So my question is, what was the vision of Hu Yaobang, perhaps also Zhao Ziyang before he stepped down, of China's political future? Was it more towards like a liberal democracy, open society, or did it a little bit reform under the one-party rule? In other words, was the purpose of reform or the reformers to make sure that the Communist Party not going towards like a cultural revolution, like a never again cultural revolution or constitutional democracy in the West?
I think from very early on, the notion of a liberal democracy in China was not fully accepted by Hu Yaobang or Zhao Ziyang. they knew that they thought, and they believed, I think quite firmly, that the Communist Party was not beyond hope. And that it could, if it just sort of set its feet on the right path, cleaned up the corruption, put in place a system that was more efficient and was able to bring younger people up to the top more quickly. And generally just had a sort of a structural reform. It wasn't, the structural reform under Zhao was a little bit more structural. Hu's was attitudinal. And that was the old guys need to step aside and let younger people who are more familiar with modern problems take the helm and do the work. So I never got a sense that Hu Yaobang was particularly sympathetic to Western democracy. He visited France, Italy, the UK, Japan, and he, in the last years of his general secretaryship, he met with leaders from all over the place. And he was accommodating. But you know, Hu Yaobang was a tuwazi. I mean, he was a peasant guy who got smart by reading. And he even read some translations of Western literature, but he had very little experience of dealing with foreigners, even when he was Secretary General and General Secretary. Just didn't go out very often. So I don't think that he was giving a lot of thought to that particular issue. What he was giving thought to was how to fix the problem that we've made ourselves, rather than to take on a completely new system. Let's fix the one we've got. He was a loyal Marxist, loyal Leninist, sort of semi-loyal Maoist. But I don't think that he was in favor of systemic change of that kind of scale.
We have time for one more question. Yes, please.
I'm Derek. I'm a student at the Elliott School, and I was wondering more about like today's implications of, you say that he was, even after being purged, people still wanted their pictures taken with him and that he was a generally popular leader among the people, but does that still hold even today? Do people still have that same aspiration for their leaders coming out and talking to them and meeting to them? Or is that mainly just like, is the historical memory of how Hu Yaobang led being lost, or is it still there? And that's why it's being suppressed with his website being taken down.
That's an interesting question. One of the things that happened a couple of years ago now was when Li Keqiang was still the premier. He went south and Xi Jinping went north. Xi Jinping met with a lot of military officials. Li Keqiang met with a lot of ordinary people. And you see the photographs of them. The military guys are all, standing straight, sitting in their chairs. And when there was a group photo, they were all lined up behind Xi Jinping. When Li Keqiang was photographed, he was talking to the people in a large body that was sort of surrounding him. And he almost made an extemporaneous speech about how reform is like a river and we can't really dam it up and stop it. So basically said, this is going to come back. Well, what happened was that Li Keqiang died under unusual circumstances, shall we say. But there was still a sense among people that youth league culture that Hu Yaobang inculcated, which was much more open and much more interested in ideas, much more interested in literature and art than the Central Propaganda Department, which is basically interested in shutting all that off. That was popular, and people recognized Hu Yaobang as a person who would listen to them, was concerned about their interests and their livelihoods, and I think that memory has survived and I'll admit that a lot of the books and articles that have been written have praised it, perhaps overly praised it. Hu Yaobang often had to back down, and he almost always did. When Deng Xiaoping or Chen Yun or somebody would say, "Where are you going with that?" He'd sort of say, "Well," I mean, there was a conference in 1979 with a bunch of ideologues, people who were in the literature and art field. And this was right after he took over as Secretary General. There was about 400 of them, and they held a meeting in Beijing. And we've yet to see many transcripts of those meetings, but a lot of these intellectuals just unloaded on Mao, just unloaded on, and Demaoization was in the air, Deng Xiaoping and Hu Yaobang were horrified by it. And Hu Yaobang knew that things had gone too far, and he basically called the newspaper people into session and said, we can't go too far or too fast on this. You know, we've got to take our time and do the job right. And basically, that conference precipitated the four upholds, the speech that Deng Xiaoping made in 1979. You know, Deng came over to the United States, and while he was away, they had this conference, and Hu Yaobang went to Deng and said, you know, they're going crazy. You know, they want to destroy Chairman Mao's reputation. And Deng Xiaoping was a basically conservative and not very ideologically disposed anyway. He didn't, I think he never met an idea he didn't dislike. But he said, no, that's got to stop. And he blamed Hu Yaobang for it. And if you look at that speech carefully, it definitely, you know, points at the General Secretary and says, fix this and do it now. And Hu Yaobang still didn't listen. He put a couple of articles in the People's Daily, 4 of them on each uphold, and reinterpreted them to support reform. And the guy who wrote it, whose name was Li Hunlin, soon disappeared. His son is here.
Well, I'm sorry we have to end this. This has been just wonderful. A great way to celebrate this tremendous achievement. So please join me in thanking Bob Suettiner.